Alright, quick check to make sure everything works. Gotta do the audio, obligatory audio check. Audio check. Alrighty, there we go. We are here at the beautiful Southern California studio known as Ponderosa Studios, and this is Jonathan Albin, the Game Master Jay, and also the host of this program, Game Master's Soapbox. And welcome back to another hour-long-ish episode. Today, as you can see, I already have a schedule up, which I do every show, and we basically speak on I speak on each of these topics, and at the end, if we have any time left for Q&A, we'll include that. And at this point, we have yet to have an audience large enough to justify it, and that's okay, because the reality is that the game masters in the world and the players in the world are busy being storytellers and players, and so they don't necessarily have time to come and watch some old guy pontificate. So, well, that's okay. Anyway, as is the case, we'll talk about these in order, but I'm going to just quickly go over the list like I usually do at the beginning. We're going to talk about the role that games play in learning, and I'm going to be speaking in general terms. I have not written a substantive paper on this. Neither am I a sociologist or psychologist, so the general nature of what I'm saying is only that general nature, and I would love to have someone who has a more direct social education background please either take me apart or put me together, so to speak, and if there's additional information available on the subject, I'd love to read it. But then the second thing we're going to talk about is social integration and choosing sides. It's a nature of the beast kind of condition where we as human beings greatly desire to be included in the activities of social groupings, and we really like the idea of being desirable enough to be picked from among others. The very concept of the pick-me-girl, or the what I call social magnet, the person that is drawn to that social interaction. There are signs and evidences of that all the time. Third one we're going to cover is wearing another's shoes. This is the concept of stepping into a role and acting in a way that would be at least coincidental with the actual person doing those things. And beyond that, we're also going to talk about the efforts and the abilities and the benefits of an active versus inactive imagination, and how the difference can be seen. And to answer the question, do you have an active or an inactive imagination? And we'll do maybe some mental exercises surrounding that. My rant today is on third-person play, and that one's to be easier explained when I'm doing the rant than to try to go through it all now. But there's a trend in role-playing that has emerged in the last at least couple of years that I hadn't recognized or noted before that, and it's kind of concerning to me, and we'll be going over that. And then finally, I mentioned it last week, and I'm starting the physical effort of putting together the parts to make this happen. So I will be putting together a video series of live stream roleplay sessions utilizing the roleplay roulette rules. And so I am looking for players who want to put themselves out there, be on a screen, and take on a variety of roles week over week over week. And unlike certain other pre-programmed live action shows, I'm great with the idea of you having acting experience, but this is going to be kind of a change in that structure. We're going to be looking at taking on archetypical roles across a wide series of genres and playing through them as a group and not knowing literally until the day of play what that genre will be. So I will be sharing with the channel a link to the actual roleplay roulette on the wheel to decide, but I don't have that available right yet. I was kind of rushed coming up to training because I'm back in a bunch of other projects going on. I'm busier now when I'm operating from home and doing my own thing than I ever was when I was employed. So there you go. So we will get right to the show. And again, I want to mention that we are sponsored by Board Game Paradise. That's the little logo in the corner down there. And my arrows are backwards now. Okay, over there. The Board Game Paradise logo represents Board Game Paradise, a game store in Redlands, California. It is a full-service games store. They carry board games, card games, miniature games, role-play games, puzzles, just none, you name it. They got game support materials, and they handle and support every kind of game out there, including role-play games. And as a further extension of that, I do run 2 games a week publicly. So if you want to come and join me, the store hours that we are operating is 6 p.m. until 10 p.m. on Mondays and Tuesdays. One is in a long-term campaign style, and the second is it's a new player group that's only been operating for about 2 or 3 weeks. So if you want to learn about role-play games or are a veteran and want to be involved with the campaign, both are available. So BoardGameParadise.com in Redlands, California. All right. Ever get turned on? I did. There we go. So now we're going to get down to it, and you wouldn't think that something as important as social interaction would be something that we would take lightly enough to play with, but the reality is that our educational system, going all the way back to preschool, is fundamentally all about the games. It's all about a game, if you will. From the very first time we're introduced to a teacher to the day we graduate with the sheepskin in our hand that we have finally achieved whatever educational processes we've gone through, we're playing games constantly. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the very process of learning only stems from our ability to associate with other people and things through imitation and play. Games are the way we can associate things in an abstract fashion to convey less abstract and more concrete correlation between things. And last week we talked a little bit about the old classic game of red light, green light, and how that simple game, although it technically has no turns, it does have rules instruction following that's required. When we learn to play games like checkers, we learn to take our turn. We learn to play within the rules, how far you can move the checker and what configuration of moves are allowed in the checkers game. The more sophisticated we get, the more sophisticated become the games. We have in the high school era, there are games that are akin to what we used to call guns and butter. It was basically a resource allocation and management process that was done in a social setting. And while the educators certainly don't see it in the aspect of it being game, nonetheless, they do set parameters. They do set restrictions on actions and define the terms of the turns. And so the very mechanic of playing is a necessary thing. And I believe it has everything to do with the fact that, or that I do believe it has everything to do with our endorphin processing for when something is accomplished. We develop a sense of we did it right when we win. We gain a rush when the experience has taught us a skill and we're able to emulate the skill sufficient enough to achieve success. We when you're playing red light, green light, usually you get to the end of the line and you get to your actually objective is to touch the arm or the hand of the judger or whatever, and so it actually rewards you with physical interaction. And I don't think we don't think about the development of that in the rules that we make, but even the simple things like learning how to walk, almost always the parent puts the child on the ground, lets them get up into a standing position, and put their hands out and say, "Come to me." So therefore, the reward for achieving is to be in the arms of a loved one. How powerful can that be? So the role of games, the role of the abstraction, is to create that endorphin flow in an artificial environment. If you're talking about somebody who is next to a fire and you tell them not to touch it, children inevitably have to want to touch it. It just we teach people to do things and we say do them, and then there are other things that we want to protect them from and we say don't do, and they sometimes get confused and think, well, I'm looking for the interaction, so if I touch this I'm going to get a reaction, and so therefore it becomes a negative reinforcement. But this entire process is an abstraction of the real in most cases. So when we can realize that, then when we look at the possibility of learning something through sheer rote memorization, or we can learn the same thing through social games interaction, it's like a no-brainer. We want the social interconnection, and we want the overarching benefit to be expressed, and so by mixing them together we end up in a scoring system. And a scoring system in any way is fundamentally what sets apart a game element from a non-game element, because as most people would say, well, a game has winners and losers, and a game is for a limited amount of time, and a game requires mental integration, and you're putting your mental power into coming up with a solution. Obviously, it also takes, in certain cases, a physical action, and even in role-play games, technically, it's number of shots on target usually means the number of victories. So even just the number of times you roll dice in a role-playing game is technically a win, and for some people who play that way, that is the element that they're looking for, in which case they are playing a role-playing game, ROLL. And we talked about that in an earlier episode, but the very concept of a game, which is sociology has termed a game to be any interaction between two or more people, wherein the process or interaction itself has no net value to the equation. When we talk about the play of games, the impetus to do so, the desire to do so, is intrinsic, because we've played games since we were children. But there is also now a social stigma that's sort of been placed on the very aspect of games by the very process of it becoming an adult in our culture. We in the 1950s, when sociology as a science was being developed, one of the key elements was that definition I just gave for game. When you were trying to look at the interaction between individuals on a abstract level, if you're looking outside looking in, you have to have some way to define the interaction in such a way that you can factor it out of comparatives between any other two individuals. Because if the interaction is so personal that it is dependent upon one variable or the other, then you can't really do a mathematical equation or even make them comparable. So sociology defined a game as any social interaction between two or more individuals wherein the interaction itself has no net value to the equation, and use that to define games to people who were growing up in our society. Now, in that time period, there were individuals that were going to school with names like Hassenfeld, and the name the Hassenfeld brothers referred to a couple of guys that were in school back in the day who were taking classes on sociology. And I'm not going to I honestly don't remember the two individuals' names, but I do know that what makes the story challenging and interesting is the fact that the last name was Hassenfeld. And as they were going through the class, and they learned that sociology said that a game has no intrinsic value within the experiment, the portion within the experiment dropped out of their thinking, and culturally came to be that way now as well, so that when you speak sociologically of a game, you are speaking of that social interaction between two or more persons wherein that social interaction has no net value. And without that little additive phrase within the equation, the game seems to be shown to have no value. Well, the person that was learning this back in the 1950s, who was instrumental in the story, a guy by the name of Hassenfeld, was talking over with his brother, and they owned a company, and they were the two people that had put together this major company that had been involved in creating games in North America for a long time. And arriving at a degree and finishing a course in sociology, one of them said, as of now, since games have no net value, that broader term, if they have no net value, then we shouldn't be producing them for adults. And this, to him, seemed to define the difference between a child's reaction and an adult's reaction. Because a child will look at a game and perceive of a value by this definition, and therefore would put themselves into situations where they would be compromised by the value of the game. And he didn't want that for his subjects, because he was externalizing and imposing upon the persons in the science experiment the concept that they were aware that it was an experiment. And so this person told his brother that the two of them would cease producing any games focused on adults. That meant that fully a third of the properties that they were currently involved in selling would have to be stopped, and they switched their focus. And these two brothers, these two bros, decided they were going to stop the production of all adult games. And so it was in the 1960s, the Hasbro company determined that they weren't going to be focused on selling games to adults anymore. They sold off their 3M line of bookshelf games. They stopped producing the higher value game products and shelved quite a few products that had either been languishing or hadn't been fully developed, and stopped being in that business altogether, instead integrating and selling games that were familiar, which means they had to do with the family, or were simply abstract enough to be something that children would be interested in, and they focused their advertising and promotion campaign to focus on that aspect. And play became something that children did and not something that adults did. And in some ways, this decision integrated into the American culture the concept that games are something that children do, and when you get to be older, you stop playing and move into the adult world. Now, it is interesting to note that also coincides with the concept of sports and the rise of socialized sports. And we're going to be going into that in this next section. But this concept of seeing play as something that only children do in games was completely flipped in reverse when it came to the next part. Okay, and so now when we're talking about the social integration and the choosing of sides, we're talking about sports. And in the reverse direction, when children are children, the first games they learn how to play on the playground are emulative. The concept of learning to play dodgeball is fundamentally learning how to hit things with a rock, but you don't throw rocks, you throw a ball. And over time, arguably, the ball got softer and bigger and whatever, so that by the time that I was in school, and here's just my back in the day moment, when I was in school, the balls were these large rubber things, and they were soft, okay, but only if you couldn't throw them hard, and they were squeezable enough that the stronger fellas could really grip that ball and get that thing wailing. And so you play a game like dodgeball as a child, especially if you're small, it's a terror experiment, but it was fundamentally abstract war. I realized that it probably isn't in favor anymore because of, number one, having a winner and a loser by the number of people that are eliminated, and the very concept of hitting each other with really big red balls has been lost. But the value of learning that emulation, that stand-in for warfare, was kind of we didn't think of it at the time. We certainly weren't seeing it as social body training for military action. We certainly didn't see it that way. But its roots definitely lie in that location. Ironically, a lot of our sports later are just extensions of that. I mean, the very concept of the best of the throwers throwing a sphere at the best of the batters is a element that traces itself to baseball and cricket, and the very concept of one flying missile being targeted and interacted by a wooden stick is the thing of legend, if you think about it from a historical standpoint. One of the most interesting thought process at the time was when they started throwing rocks at you, instead of diving behind cover, you pulled out sticks and tried to hit them back. And in a way, I suppose that's a form of economy, because you're turning the missiles that the enemies have chosen into the missiles of their own destruction, and therefore you're reintegrating thought processes into a brutal, if you will, physical action. But this kind of over-the-top and obviously pretty clear allegory later develops into more sophisticated rules, more sophisticated game mechanisms, whether it be soccer or football. The concept of, at the beginning of your gym period, having two player captains chosen by the teacher or educator to choose teams is a element of all of our collective history that either brings us joy because we remember getting picked and being pleased to be on a team, or it brings us terror because we know that we're going to be either the last one chosen or the odd man out, and have to be given from one team to the other. That was always a fun part of that process, and you can tell perhaps from my reaction to the whole idea, it still causes me to shudder, that I was more than likely on the low end of that stick. I was never a athletic person, and I wasn't a sports guy. By the way, I want to thank you if you're watching, because I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share this information. And if you want, you can place any questions you want in the chat. I do respond to them, not necessarily instantaneously, but throughout the show I'll respond to that. And also, when I get to the Q&A part, any questions that are left remaining will come from those. So feel free to post anything there. At any rate, the idea of this social integration does all kinds of things culturally. Our culture today has things like pick-me girls, somebody who presents an image just on the idea that you'll take a look at what they're doing. The very idea of doing a broadcast like this one, arguably, could be seen as a vain attempt to get people to pay attention to who I am, to the words I have to say. But the tighter definition, of course, of the pick-me is that we want a segment of the population's time to react to what we're doing. And this need for acceptance and inclusion stems right back to this very process. We're all in a group, and the team captains are picking between sides to create teams for some social interaction that's going to be in the form of a game, and that game is going to play out in a limited amount of time and a limited number of turns and a limited number of actions, and we have to prepare to be part of that whole, and therefore societally we're being put into a position. And there's all kinds of huge dynamics that play into it. I mean, if you're a team captain, which is better, to grab a arbitrary poor player early on in the process and therefore increase your pool from which to choose your next choice, or do you pick the best first? And historically, at least in my experience as a child, they pick the best first, and that is how we learn. And by doing what we did then, we then do the same thing when we get older, and we pick the persons to be on our team that have the best capabilities of success overall. In other words, you pick the biggest, you pick the fastest, you pick the most coordinated, you pick the even comes down to it, you pick the ones who are more socially integrated. Because even if there is a player who has all the physical capabilities, if he's an unknown, and this is me in the case of my childhood, I was always perpetually the new kid on the block. I moved 40 times before I was 18. I went to 22 different grade schools, 6 different high schools. When you're always perpetually the new kid on the block, you're an unknown, and therefore social choice around and concerning you is going to be suspect, because they don't know enough about you, so they will leave your choice out of the equation, even if you are a competent choice. Now, I can't say in my defense, because in all reality, I was optimally not one you would pick anyway. Even as a freshman in high school, I only weighed like 67 pounds. I was a little bitty tyke, and so being chosen for a sporting event, they look for the biggest, they look for the strongest, they look for the fastest, and then after that they pick the ones who are socially connected, because the decision-making process itself is a social engagement and can even be tested sociologically. But this integration process through choosing sides does create the entire parsing process, wherein players are either marked and left out, or are pushed to the side. It affects their social interaction. It affects their social ID. It really messes them up. So this leads, of course, into the very conversation on sports itself. And as I spoke of a week or so ago, the need to cheat, to break the rules in a sports environment, is not only more palatable, but more revered and expected and accepted than it is in game play. And that those violations of rules leads to either a changing of the rules or a changing of the play field. I'm reminded of the fact that there was a change some years ago in the construction mechanisms of a baseball. And try as they might, the new ball that they were creating was a better ball for the game, per se. And in the process, they made it so the ball was hit more often, it was hit further, the speed at which the ball could move was increased, the speed, therefore, that a pitcher could throw was increased, the likelihood of a batter connecting was reduced. All of these elements were factored in, and today's big data universe is fundamentally just an extension, if you will, of the guys that played Stratomatic baseball back in the 50s, because the point is that big data points out things that you wouldn't necessarily instantaneously see with your eyes. So a change in the integration of a ball mechanism creates a change in the outcomes, which changes the rules and the scoring, and therefore the statistics of the game overall. And in the same fashion, switching from a games mentality where cheating is anathema to a social interaction process and games that are sports wherein cheating is promoted and exacerbated leads to naturally a cultural change. And sometimes we look at the world as we see it and we don't realize how much those things are associated with our play mechanisms, the way we play. All right, lost another 10 minutes. Here we go. So I got to switch on. Well, this leads us to working with a subject that is near and dear to my heart, the idea of wearing another's shoes. I remember a good friend of mine used to always quote the old saying that says, if you ever are considering the challenges of this world, take a bit and walk a mile in another person's shoes. That way, when you're done, you've got an extra pair of shoes and you're a mile away from them. Now, the idea of wearing another's shoes is actually a conversation about taking on a different perspective, stepping into another role. The very concept that this comes from ties back to the biblical story of Moses and the overseer, and the idea is that you get the point where you are in a position where you get to step into the role of another, and what do you do with that power? When you have the ability to see the perspective of standing in the position and perspective of another person, you are having to think literally almost with another mind. You have to create a mental framework within your framework to interpose a personality that isn't you, as if you were in the other person's shoes, and then to think about what life does for that emulation. And in some ways, this is, I believe, very much parallel to our current concerns with artificial intelligence, because we are creating a mechanism that we are trying to consider how we can get it to think like we think, and therefore we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the other and figure out what it is that is thought itself. Philosophers have been doing this for thousands of years, and the very concept of contemplating the other person, as I said, it's a biblical principle, the idea of the parable. You put in a story and say, consider this position. How would your life be if you were in that situation instead of the one you're in? Consider a lily in the valley. Consider a lily. Plants don't think. They don't have the capacity. Even if I'm a really, really good biologist, I can tell you that the plant does not have a nervous system per se, and it does have fluid transfer protocols, and it does have means for moving nutrition around, and it can react to things like temperature and humidity and mineral access and all of this. But there's no thought. So how can you consider the lilies of the valley? Because to consider them is to put yourself in a mindless state. Oh. Oh. That's what it is. Wearing another's shoes is actually putting yourself in the position where you have to limit your own access to the access of the other person, which in one case seems liberating, because you could think, consider yourself to be a genie, a wizard, a fantastic, powerful being, or consider a lily in the valley, and consider a plant and what it goes through. Yet it gets arrayed in finery. It gets to wear really beautiful clothes. It gets to be a beautiful thing. Beauty exudes from it. So is that not acceptable? Is that not fascinating? Is that not cool? And when we start to wear another's shoes, then we can actually start to play others' roles. We can say, okay, well, I personally never fired well, I have now. I could say you'd say I never fired a firearm, but I was in the military, and so it's a requisite. The concept of doing something that we wouldn't normally do, and then thinking about what it would be like if we did, is integral to role playing, and it also therefore is a socially learning mechanism that we should consider. When it comes to deciding whether something is good or bad, we need to consider walking in other shoes. There's pop songs about it. There's whole interactive processes where the TV program Undercover Boss, he's role-playing his own employee. These all are examples of how games are involved in our learning, and how we pick up the capabilities of learning new things that we haven't considered by interacting with them through these methods. So this leads therefore to a discussion on imagination itself. If let's say just a simple one. The words if itself is a imaginative triggering word. What changed? What is different? When we are young, we don't have a frame of reference for anything, and so emulation, replication of what we see, is all we have to work with. We're fascinated, and we study for a long time the verbal structures of children to see how they learn to say mama, how they learn to say dada, and even these simple things with big data can be analyzed to the nth degree, because you can count the number of children overall, and then count the number of those who are documented to have said mama first versus the number of them that said data first, and correlate that information, and then compare that with the actual parenting regimens and such. And I don't know the numbers. I'm not a sociologist that's looking at big number data is not my thing. But the issue is that the way we learn as small children is through emulation. And so we practice what we see. We do the things we see others do. And of course, it's charming as heck when you watch your son go through his morning routine doing the kinds of things that you as a parent unit did, or do. I was when my kids were small, I owned a trucking company and was gone on a daily basis delivering packages. So I would always wear shorts and a polo shirt, and wore a pair of gloves because the work was demanding on my hands when I'm lifting and carrying things. So my wife at the time was caring for our son. And when he got ready to go to school one day, what did he do but put on a pair of shorts and a shirt and he didn't have gloves like I had. He had this big pair of clunky winter mittens, was the only gloves he had. But he comes out of the bedroom in a spring afternoon, 80 degrees outside. He's wearing a pair of shorts and a polo shirt that had a Winnie the Pooh on the pocket and a pair of winter mittens. And my wife says, "Where are you going?" And he says, "I'm going to work." And that emulation, that replication of what you see, is a mechanism of human identity and human will. We choose to practice the things that we see in order to become acceptable to the others around us. And in certain cases, this can be absolutely emulative and exactly an impression of what we've seen done. And that is not imagination, that is imitation. So when we speak of an active versus an inactive imagination, to what I'm referring is this concept of when you look at a process and you superimpose upon it a allegorical thing that already exists. That's imitation, not imagination. The idea that you sell a pair of tennis shoes with, name your character. I'm so old. I want to use ancient characters like Luke Skywalker to sell Star Wars, but you put BB-8 on something to get people to purchase that thing, so that they will think or conceive of the things as if BB-8 would do them. The idea of this imitative process becomes a replacement for imagination, because yes, it still is an act of the mind, and an active mind is where the concept of imagination comes from. It is the imagining, the mental picturing of something that doesn't exist. And therefore we imagine fictional stuff. And because we imagine fictional stuff, cultural and societally, we then superimpose images that we force into that framework to use, so that when a child is growing up, instead of the saying, hang on a second. For some reason, I'm fighting with a dry throat. Rather than saying, "Oh, look, there's a spaceship," and not having a defining characteristic for what that is, instead you superimpose in a creation done by a willful adult mind is superimposed on the child, and suddenly it says, "Oh, look, it's the Millennium Falcon." Your process has short-circuited the active imagination and replaced it with an inactive imagination, because there was no creative process within the mind of the child to create what a spaceship looks like. Another example of this is in childhood. I would read prolifically any of the science fiction materials I could find. Whether it be Heinlein or Arthur Clarke or Asimov, or name author here, Zelazny, etc., etc., etc. These fictional things were being described, and it was up to my mind to create the images of what those things were. Frank Herbert's Dune is an absolute example. You read the book Dune, and then you look at the various versions that have been created, and some of them get it sort of spot on. They create what you remember from what you read, but other places they don't, and yet you start to see them in that framework, and it's hard to see them otherwise. For example, the Emperor Padishah IV from, I believe it was I can't remember. It was the one with Sting. That actor, in my mind, is the Emperor Shaddam IV. And we of course have not seen him in the current Dune movie, although there may be parts of him or scenes of him in episode 2. But in the original movie version, there's no exemplar for what he looks like. So in my mental picture, he still looks as the actor did in, which is gosh, almost had his name in the set just a second ago. But if you'll notice that my brain's going through the process of actually trying to go through the files and remember the actor's name. But the idea is that the inactive imagination is arguably more powerful than the active imagination without practice. In other words, if you haven't utilized your active imagination, if you pick up a science fiction book that you haven't seen a movie for, or you have to really pay attention to the writing to get an idea of what the imagery is there, so that your brain can actually construct the wireframe and everything inside of your brain for you to be able to see that craft as it's described. That process is an active imagination, and is why the very concept of holding to a movie or a plot theme requires either spoon feeding through narration or great vistas and extra time to process as you're watching the film. This element of active imagination is extremely powerful. It creates a loyalty and an acceptance that is not there in the inactive imagination. But an inactive imagination can correlate data faster because it's not spending the energy to create itself. This is why role-play games, to me, are so powerful, because the storyteller's gift, his capacity for conveying information, is dependent upon his ability to lay down the foundation with enough anchors that the players can wireframe the creation of the elements of the story to make it a real place for them. And once they have an understanding and a grip on what's going on in the world, then they will be able to interact with it in a more complete and more realistic and more visceral fashion. Therefore, it's important, and it depends on us to foment this active imagination, and that leads to the concept of why we need to be first person in the experience to understand and embrace this created universe. So now I get to stop and do my rant, and this is as always, I'm going to try to hold out to the beginning of an even minute on my clock here so that I give it a fair shake. I don't want to go over my limit of 10 minutes, but I do feel that we need to cover this one in some detail, and that is the concept of third person play. Alrighty. To use the term imagine we have just put a situation together where you have a character in a story, in a scene, in a room with a box of resources and a tabletop and a workbench and some tools. Given all those things, if I said to you, what would you do? Well, if this is your character, what would you do? About a fifth of the players wouldn't know what the hell I'm talking about. They wouldn't be able to conceive of being in that scene because that's not how they operate. They haven't played a role-play game. They haven't experienced this kind of mental exercise at all. So 1 out of 5 is going to be going, you got to tell me more. I got to understand more. Another 1/5 is going to say, well, great, but I don't have a list of statistics, namely a character sheet, so I don't know what parameters by which I can interact are. A third would be, you said a box of resources, but you didn't define what they were, and I can't operate with just a box with generic stuff in it. What is it that's in it? And then finally, somebody's just going to walk over and pull out the tools and start making something. This variation of the ways people play leads also to the final version, and that is the person says, well, my character will walk over to the box and, looking into the box, choose from the box some items and begin to function. This third person mechanism has got to go. When I am ranting about the third person, I am speaking of a role play situation where I, as a game master, have created a situation, I created a scene, I've even put the characters and potentially a line of dialogue into play. And I'm all looking for is the person to take on his role and play the scene. And it drives me crazy when a person says, well, my person would do this, or my tune would do this, or the tune would say they're not playing the scene. They're not integrating into the role play of it. Instead, they're staying above the tabletop. They are fundamentally like a video game, pushing the little guy on the screen to go do something, and they're not integrating into the scene. And this drives me insane, because this is where we as storytellers have failed our audiences. And I have to apologize if I have in the past put you in a position where you have felt that you had to stay in the third person. I want to greatly apologize, because that is never the case. A role play game is the game wherein you play roles. And so when you get given when you're afforded the opportunity to take the stage and speak the lines and be a part of the scene, then do so. For all that's holy, do that which you came here to do. A role play is literally taking on the role and playing it. Yes, Overcord, you're exactly right. And it's what my character would do. I love it when they say that, because it means that they are still in third person. And that is one of the reasons why in the NycosRPG mechanism, your character is defined specifically as you have subsumed the role of a being on the planet. It isn't that your character creation spontaneously spawns a new being and it's a rezzed-in figure that's a cartoon of the rest of the world. Instead, you are stepping into the role of somebody who lives there, and you're now living their life. And so therefore, when scenes cast to you, you have to, by nature, cast in as well and become part of the scene. But the third person aspect that harms the game, I believe, the most, is that the concept of injury and harming of others, which is an integral part of a role-play game, that you are going to be in a fight scene, and there is going to be bloodshed, and there are going to be people and creatures injured. That very process is by nature a first-person activity, and the more we push it to the third person, and the more we push it away from our own interaction, the less visceral the experience will be, the less useful the experience would be. We need to be able to stand in that place. Yes, there are moments where you have to fight a David versus Goliath fight, but that means, David, you have to choose to throw the rocks. It has to be you throwing the rocks. It can't be that guy in the Bible story. It's you. The player is synonymous with the character. Now, before all the fire bells go off and somebody screams for the police, says that I'm advocating people to hurt each other, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying in a game environment, strictly defined as the game environment, there are interactions that require a player to take on a personality and a presence that equates to a personality and a presence in a fictional environment where that kind of physical violence is part and parcel to survival. And where those actions do have ramifications, but they're certainly handled considerably differently than our culture. So, if it is an offense to you to step into a role and have the mentality of someone other than yourself, I would say you need to get a new social circle, because the point is that we are constantly interacting in other shoes, whether it be in our cultural lessons, if it's in our history lessons, if it's in our, even I suppose in some mathematics lessons, we consider the presence of being an element, a molecule on a process of motion and considering what that experience would be. That's fundamentally also role play. But the idea here is that you have to get out of third person and into the first person, specifically for the interaction to be visceral enough to have an impact. I can tell you there are dozens of times when I've put a role player in an environment where they, for the first time, are having to engage physically with an enemy, and by the end they're beating the other person into unconsciousness. And you can see on their faces the actual pain as they're considering what they're actually in-game doing, and the post-scene functioning of their brains as they go, oh goodness, that person assaulted me, and so I defended myself, and now they're on the ground and unconscious and bleeding, and I did that. That is one of the most powerful moments in a role-play environment, to have to sit with that and consider it. And it is a sad, sad world we're in, where instead of that, everybody is able to fade back and say, well, that's Rocky hitting Bullwinkle. That's the Roadrunner smacking Wile E. Coyote once again with the results of his labors. The comeuppance is taken away from the player, and the requisite judgment that they have taken is removed from them and put into limbo, and therefore the action now is an abstract. One of the longest running jokes about Dungeons and Dragons is the idea of a group that happens upon a gazebo in the backyard of a person, and not knowing what a gazebo is by description, players make the tragic decision that it must be some sort of monster that must be defeated, and they spend the next 20 minutes obliterating and destroying the poor gazebo. But when we are put in a first person place of having to think about what that is, that we are engaging with another being, and it has real life ramifications, but in a fictional world where the justice system is either more severe or perhaps less sophisticated, you have to consider the ramifications and the decision making that you would make in that role. And this is my rant. When you are a player and you are put in a scene, for goodness sake, play the scene. Be in that moment, because there is something important that the narrator, the storyteller, the game master is trying to convey. Even if it's just simply that you are a part of a real world, that the injuries that you do to others are real, that the concept of bloodshed is visceral in that realm as much as it is here. And all of those make for a much different justifiable system. And when you are a player and you have decided to step away from that because it's not familiar or comfortable to you, you have to consider that maybe the issue is that your discomfort is a requisite now for your continued activity, because the third person is not doing it. If you look at video games marketplace and the number of people who play characters in those worlds who arguably have done either really terrible things to the game and broken it, or have done really impossible things and had to create mods and manipulated the software and stuff, that there's all kinds of directions that it could go, wherein the person in the third party is no longer interacting in the game as it intended. But more importantly, the very concept of being in a role-play game is taken away from us when we go to that third-person view, when we step back away from the character in such a fashion. And I just can't stand it. So, alrighty. So I'm going to get off my rant table now. Thank you, Overcord. I'll be reading your comments here in a second, and we'll discuss them. But before that, I do want to mention that the last point on our docket for today is a mention of the upcoming live stream of Roleplay Roulette. if you are a role player of any skill level, beginner to Vanguard expert, whatever, if you have role played in the past or want to try role play for the first time and you haven't, Roleplay Roulette is the perfect mechanism for this because it is a diceless, levelless, and arguably character-driven role-play environment. We have a rotisserie, a spinning wheel, if you will, of 20 or so different genres. And during a live stream event, I will be operating that wheel and creating a story from whatever the wheel spins up among the players that are involved. And the players will then choose and define themselves in terms of archetypical roles that would fit that genre. So, for example, Dark Shards is the fantasy setting for the world of Nykos, and the name given to the fantasy setting on Roleplay Roulette. So if we spin up Dark Shards, then the players will take on the archetypical roles of the party's fighter / tank, the party's rogue, the party's wizard, and so on. These archetypical character roles are not actually defining the character, but they are explaining why the character is in the story and how they're important to the dynamic of the story. Then, regardless of who that is, as soon as everybody is assigned characters, the story immediately begins, and we play through the scenario for that genre that I created on the spot. At the same time, the characters are choosing the archetypes. The mechanism here will require a audition video to be sent to me, so you can send it to my direct email, or you can leave me your email, or you can send me contact information and I can get back to you. In any way, we have to get that from you. If you are a Patreon member, you can get kind of a leg up on the process, because by being a Patreon member, you have access to my Discord, and having Discord means you can actually leave me a message or actually speak with me about your potential being on this show. The choices that I'm going to be making will be not only on the basis of visual appeal, but it'll be also on character background and presence of character. The idea of having people who other people want to see is great, but having people that people need to see is more important. So this is one of the elements that goes into the choosing of the people to be on the Roleplay Roulette. At this time, I also want to mention that on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m., we are still running the Nykos Twitch roleplay experiment, which is if you jump onto Twitch as a viewer, you can actually participate in the role-playing game that runs on Saturday mornings by providing input as if you were the character. And therefore, you can interact and such. And again, I'll mention that if you go to patreon.com/Nykos and become a supporter at the $20 level or higher, you will get access to the Discord and to speaking capabilities on that Discord, and therefore can become a member who participates with me on the show in audio form, and perhaps, depending on the time frame, perhaps even having a visual image of you on the screen. So that's all part of the process for being a Patreon. Now, I will do an entire episode on the benefits of doing the different projects that I'm involved with and what you can do to be a part of it. But just know that the live stream Roleplay Roulette element is going to happen only when I've gotten enough audition recordings to have a reasonable number of players, between 4 and 6 players, who actively want to be a part of it and have provided me the information to do so. So that's Forrest Gump would say, that's all I got to say about that. So let me go ahead and take a gander at the notes that Overcourt has sent us. Overcourt says, very true. In my experience, when players look back in the events, they typically refer to it as first person. But sometimes in the moment where a player is making a decision that they know to be unpopular, the third person mode becomes a shield to say, it's what my character would do. That's the real challenge to the game masters as well, though, to express things in a way relevant to the character, rather than using modern shorthanded language for the character, such as the gazebo. Exactly, Overcourt. You've nailed the third party argument specifically. We need to be able to experience the situation as individuals, So as game masters, it depends on us to portray it in a fashion that puts it in the first person, so that the other person isn't on the spot and that they can respond as themselves. Great point. I greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much for that. So, before I close today, I do have some viewers, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask or comments you'd like to make about the show, I greatly appreciate that. Remember, if you like the content you've seen so far, make sure you click on the like button for this episode, subscribe to the channel so you get notifications, click the bell for it on the YouTube page to make sure that you get the right level of notifications. And please also, if you can, do as Overcord does and make comments, because it helps the algorithm to know that people are interacting with the channel and such. So the more that you produce and share information with me, the more likely the shows will be picked up by more people. Yes, I will say again that if you didn't get a chance to watch yesterday's episode 13, I believe it may have been the best one I've done to date, and you really should take a look at it and share it with others, because it's looking at the concept of play in general and how everything that we do is fundamentally an extension of our playful reality. So, yeah, thank you, Overcourt. The NycosRPG mechanism is actually the short version. It is a saddle-built mechanism, which means you can play Dungeons and Dragons as is written in 5e, and utilize the rules of NycosRPG as a saddle. You just add the mechanisms for how NycosRPG works over the top of other roleplay systems, and it will function perfectly for that. It basically supplants the standard saving throw mechanism and skill-based system, and instead converts it to a full skill-based system. The die rolling is all done on percentage dice to make it intuitive. So if you say somebody's got a 25% chance of success, you know that you're going to be rolling the dice to get 25% or lower. The other thing that we add that you don't find anywhere else and has never been really explored, as far as I can tell in my 50 years of experience, the concept that a die roll generates not one but 5 responses. So from a single die roll, you not only get perfect success, but you also get a wild success, something more than expected. You have your standard success, where it's what you would expect altogether. You have a partial success, because there's those times when you don't really fully connect, but you're still nonetheless impacted. And then you have failure. So that's 5 different responses from a single die roll. And the mechanism to do so is really easy to explain. I'm going to go ahead and explain it, but it may miss. I got you. Pathfinder is more of a skills-based system, so that sort of makes sense. It's also much more of a rules-based mechanism. So if you are rules crunchy, you will be somewhat less than thrilled with the NycosRPG, because NycosRPG is a rules light but spirit broad. So the idea that there are overarching connotations to what happens in a roleplay game that are taken into account in NycosRPG but cannot be in a crunchy roleplay system. So it's a D100 percentage-based system, and the graduated die rolling overtakes the need for a turn versus turn, roll to hit, roll to miss, roll to hit, roll to miss, roll to hit, roll to miss nonsense that we've fallen into. What I call the bam bam effect that no longer applies. You don't have to have 2 tough guys swinging away incessantly to knock each other's hit points down to end a conflict. You can simply achieve a conflict resolution by 1 die roll each. You roll against your success in the combat, they roll against their success in the combat. If one of you succeeds and the other fails, the fight's over. That has ramifications, of course. Maybe you have won the fight, so to speak, but he is a stronger person than you, then is the fight really over? And so therefore the winner in that case gets to invoke a condition or 2 or 3 on the opponent, depending on the graduated difference between the die rolls. So if you get a perfect success, you roll the 1 in 100, and sounds like me, man. Over courses, he's played all kinds of games going back to Shadowrun and GURPS. Yes, who hasn't? We all are looking for panacea. The reason why NycosRPG finally actually hit print was the realization that the concepts of what I'm talking about here, this concept of using an abstract die roll to end a conflict and the use of skills and conditions to resolve the conflict, makes for a more narrative and more cinematic environment for play. I would recommend, if you get a chance, join us on Saturdays for the roleplay experiment. And if you can't make Saturdays, of course you can. As a member of our Patreon, we do have a Patreon-only roleplay group that plays on Sunday afternoons. And we play from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific time on Sundays. And once you back the Patreon program at the $20 value, you'll gain access to our Discord channel. And as a member of the Discord, you can join us over audio and even turn on your camera if you'd like and play. It's not broadcast. It's not put out for public consumption. It is surely something I do as a benefit to my Patreons. So definitely catch up with us on either one of those. And if you want to know more about the NycosRPG system, you can go back. There's several episodes in the playlist for the podcast that include additional information about it, including the concept of the graduated die roll is actually discussed, and I'm calling it fundamentally quantum die rolling. The idea that just as a quantum object has 5 different states until it is observed, the same thing is true in a conflict situation. You don't know what the conflict resolution is until you roll the dice and observe the number. And then that number tells you where you are on the spectrum, which of the results that you have. And because it's done mechanically and mentally, it's instantaneous. So it's not required to go look up a chart. There's no requisite to have to do anything other than a quick math function. Yes, Schrodinger's conflict. Exactly. The perpetual swing that is being borne in through my mallet, is it successfully landing aside your head, or is it swooshing over, or is it hitting you in the spleen instead? Let's find out. Exactly. And so utilizing that methodology, hit or miss becomes the norm of it. We already think this way. When D&D was first invented, when I first learned to play it, when I was 11, there was no question that each die roll was a swing of the sword. And so it was obvious pretty quickly that it was not really a fair system. If one person had a better strength and a bigger weapon, they would always seem to win, and so that didn't seem right to me. And there really wasn't an issue of this thing called initiative, because there was also a speed factor associated with the weapon, and so as you move the weapon through space, the speed factor would determine when it would land its blow. But we devised, even way back then in 2nd edition, a method that created fundamentally an advantage or disadvantage mechanism without calling it that, wherein the person who had the reach on the weapon had the initiative benefit at first. But once the person with the smaller weapon got past that defense, the condition was reversed, and now the little guy had to go first until the person with the longer weapon was able to drive them back away. So, yeah, exactly. The big heavy weapons took longer to swing. So what we would do is you would roll your initiative, you would modify it by your dexterity and by the speed factor of your weapon and create a number, and that number may not be discrete, but generally speaking, the number of players in a group would spread across the spectrum, and therefore you would go from the highest value down to from the lowest value up to the highest, and that was because a low initiative meant you were moving faster. Well, we soon switched that because the pole arms and the long weapons would have this huge modifier to push them way to the back, and that didn't quite seem fair. So we decided on a flip-flop mechanism. So if you were in combat, you were either in combat range, or you were in close range, or you were in contact. And if you were in contact, then the small weapons were at a disadvantage, and the long weapons were incapable of actually getting into the fight because they weren't fast enough. And then reverse that, as if you were at range, the long heavy weapons would go first, and then the regular weapons, and then down to the hand-to-hand. So it would create a dynamic effect that would split it up, but it was still hit, miss, and for decades that bothered me. And I will be tomorrow doing a video in particular that I will include on the history of war games and how that it impacted tabletop RPGs, and why that issue is still going on, that was actually fomented and created in the 1960s and hasn't been replaced yet, and how we can look at replacing that in the NycosRPG process. So until tomorrow's show, thank you for watching. Today is I have to look at the calendar. Today is Monday. Oh my goodness. That's because it's after midnight. Yes, it's okay. Scared myself to death because I told you I have games on Monday and Tuesday. I looked at the calendar just that second, and my brain went, "Oh no, you were supposed to be at the game tonight." It's like, no, I wasn't. That's tonight. So it's Monday now because it's after midnight. But it's Sunday night's episode. So I will see all of you tomorrow night, Monday night at 10 p.m. If you have the capability in Southern California region, do feel free to stop by the Board Game Paradise. That's their logo down in the corner down there. Board Game Paradise full function retail store on State Street in Redlands, California. They have a website, boardgameparadise.com, and they're also available on Facebook and basically in every other media as well. I am Jonathan Albin. I want to thank Overcord and the rest of you that have been viewing with us for your attention to the show tonight, and I hope to have you click the follow button so you can keep up on the shows as they go. Click the subscribe button on the YouTube channel. YouTube is at NycosRPG, and you can follow the episodes there. I have it set up as a podcast, so you can go back and catch all of the previous episodes and get caught up to speed. And I do the show every night at 11 o'clock, so I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you so much, Overcord, and everyone else that's been with us, and we'll see you next time. This is Jonathan Albin, Game Master J, for the game.